All right, why don't I go ahead and get started? I'm Glen Kosaka. I run product management for NeuVector. Thanks for joining me today. These sessions are pretty casual, so if you have any questions, I think there's a Q&A button you can push, and I'll see your questions, or you can just put things in the chat if you prefer. So today we're going to cover some NeuVector 101 basics. I'll provide an overview of NeuVector. I can show you the actual product itself. But this is really designed to answer any questions you have about Kubernetes security, container security, and the NeuVector product itself. So feel free to pop in questions as we go along, and I'll make sure I check that along the way. We have a small group today, so you can get a lot of your questions answered if you wish. All right, so let's dive right in. So I'll start with a really high-level view. The Gartner group talks about a container security hierarchy. And these are all the types of security layers in what Gartner calls defense in depth that should be implemented. And the top dark blue sections are really some of the most critical, especially if you are protecting sensitive data or if you have a business critical application that just can't go down. There are foundational controls, which are kind of just your basic core things that you need to have in place. And then there's also basic controls, which just assume signing and passwords and things like that. So what we're going to cover today is how NeuVector can provide this really critical top layer of defense in depth. And that includes a view of the network for containers, just like you need to be able to protect a network in non-container environments. You need to do that in Kubernetes and containers as well. Behavior application behaviors, you need to be able to monitor and control that. End-to-end vulnerability management, and then protect ingress, egress, files, all of those things as well. Now, NeuVector also provides some of this bottom level stuff, hardening, running CIS benchmarks or Kubernetes benchmarks. So we also provide some of the foundational controls. All right, so vulnerability management is one of the key areas, and I'm sure you're very interested in this whole topic. So we're going to cover how NeuVector provides that first. So NeuVector provides what we call full lifecycle container security. And that's from the build phase all the way into test, staging, and production. And that really starts with the vulnerability and compliance management layer. So what you can do is make sure that as developers bring a bunch of open source components into your pipeline and they start to build their applications, and then they create a container image from those, right at that point is the first time you should do the vulnerability scanning and compliance scanning of that container image. And so you can trigger the NeuVector scan through a Jenkins plugin, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, GitLab plugins. All of those things can trigger a scan right there when the developer is trying to build that image. And if that image contains vulnerabilities, you can reject it and force them to remediate those. Once it passes the build phase, it typically gets stored in a registry. And that's where NeuVector will be able to scan the registry for vulnerabilities as well. And this is really to make sure that you may have had approved images in the registry, but a week later, a critical vulnerability was discovered in that image. So what we're able to do is to scan that in the registry. And then we are able to then proceed all the way into the staging and production environments to run the CIS benchmarks to make sure that all your configurations are correctly set and audited. Produce compliance reports to help you if you need to achieve PCI or GDPR, SOC 2 compliance. And then in production, we're able to scan all running containers, the host operating system as well, and the orchestrator platform itself. Because as you may know, the Kubernetes API server, kubelet, or your Istio proxy may also have critical vulnerabilities. So that's an additional attack surface that you need to be concerned about. Now, one of the biggest challenges is to figure out, well, I've got 500 vulnerabilities that I've discovered everywhere in containers and on hosts. Which are the most critical ones that I should pay attention to? And so that's where we produce these risk reports and help you do the remediation. And basically the way we do that is you're able to filter that by which ones are most severe or critical, and also show you, are there any running containers that come from that image? Because if there's one that's currently running in production, those are the ones that you should pay attention to if they're critical. And also, not all vulnerabilities have fixes available. So you can only look at the ones where you can patch those and remediate those back in development. But for the ones that don't have patches available and you're often forced to run images or hosts that do have vulnerabilities, you can rest assured that NeuVector, when you turn our runtime protection and our runtime security on, will be able to protect those containers once they start running in production. So any attempt to exploit that vulnerability, we will be able to detect and even block. So that's where we get into the, well, how do we do that? How do we provide runtime protection? Well, the first aspect of that you should consider is the link between vulnerability scanning and the runtime environment. And that's what's called admission controls. That's where you can define a bunch of rules that prevent unauthorized or vulnerable images from being deployed into production. So, for example, you're able to say, if there's a critical vulnerability and there's a fix available, and this was published more than a week ago, block that deployment. But if there's no fix available, just alert us on that, and but let it through. And so we're able to control what gets into the production environment. Now, once in production, that's where NeuVector's runtime protection kicks in. And for that, we have really three major aspects: a container firewall, which is going to be able to essentially implement a layer 7 application layer firewall. And we're going to be able to inspect all of your traffic before it can either ingress or egress out of the cluster or between pods in the cluster. The second and third major areas are process monitoring and file monitoring within a container itself. So we're really combining network inspection with process monitoring and inspection and file activity monitoring. Together, we can then protect that workload. And any attempt to exploit a vulnerability, any malware that starts in the container, zero-day attacks, any of those things, bad things that can happen, we're going to be able to detect because they're going to use either a network connection to get in or out of the container. They're going to initiate a new process that we haven't allowed, or they're going to start some new file activity. Now, one of the key aspects for implementing security into modern cloud-native pipelines, which are highly automated, is implementing what's called security policy as code. And so for that, you're able to use the behavioral learning of NeuVector to be able to learn all of the behavior of your applications in a test or staging environment. You're then able to review all of the rules that NeuVector has automatically created for you. So those would be what network connections are allowed, what process and file activity did we observe, and then you're able to lock that container down. You're able to then export those rules in the form of security as code. And that's a typical Kubernetes YAML file, which is in the format or using something called CRD, which is a custom resource definition. And so for that, you're able to then manage the security policies for all your applications as code or YAML files. Check them into your Git repo, push them into the production environment. And then if you update your applications, either your DevOps team, your developers can say, hey, I need a new network connection. We need to check out that code, add that to allow that new network connection, test it, and then check it back in, and then push it into production to update the security rules for that application. So this is a quick high-level overview of the NeuVector product line. All right, I don't see any questions, but feel free to ask questions in the question box or put some in the chat if you do have any. All right, so let's get a little bit into a little bit more detail here. So first of all, vulnerability management is critical, right? I mean, you have to do it. It's part of compliance regulations, et cetera. However, keep in mind that when you're looking at vulnerabilities, you're really looking in the rearview mirror, right? You're really seeing if something nasty has occurred in the past and can come up to bite you. But it doesn't really look forward. You know, it's not looking into new attacks or zero-day attacks. And so vulnerability scanning, while it's necessary, is limited, and it's not going to really protect you in runtime. It's going to reduce the risk of the exploit in runtime. So what you need to be able to do to look forward into your production environment is critically be able to understand how your network traffic is flowing between your pods, between your worker nodes, and ingress and out of the cluster. And then also within every container, the process and file activity in that. So with NeuVector, we're able to inspect all of that network traffic. The east-west traffic is, that's what we call the traffic that goes within the cluster between pods, whether that's on the same host or between hosts. And we're able to observe that traffic when you run your test traffic through. We're able to create a layer 7 application protocol specific firewall rule to allow certain connections between containers. We're also able to do deep packet inspection, so we can inspect that traffic and see if any sensitive data, credit card information is in that network traffic. North-south traffic, your typical gateway or egress firewall can take a look at some of that traffic. But it's critical to understand if a pod is connecting into or out of the cluster, where that's coming from and where that's going to, because you also need to be able to allow or block certain types of north-south traffic. And NeuVector provides that, all of that as well. As I mentioned, it's a deep packet inspection. So we're really looking into the payload and all of the protocol information. It's not just layer 3, layer 4. Although if you want to create a layer 3, layer 4 IP address and port rule, you can in NeuVector. But we're really combining the network security with the process and file activity. So because we're able to look into the packet, we're able to then learn the traffic using behavioral learning in a test environment. We're able to create those rules automatically for you and then export them as security as code. Once you put and lock down those containers in production, it's going to provide protection against zero-day attacks, unknown, undisclosed vulnerabilities. We're also going to be able to do packet capture, kind of like the TCP dump, but we're going to put it in the context of this container, this pod exhibited this type of packet behavior. And we're going to be able to implement data loss prevention by inspecting the payload for sensitive data like credit cards and social security numbers. You can also program that with your own regular expressions to look for certain types of traffic within the network connection. Now, under the covers, the way NeuVector works is completely cloud native. NeuVector is a container itself. And so you deploy our containers the same way you deploy any Kubernetes application. So the first set of containers are what's called controllers. And that's kind of like the brains. It's very much like the Kubernetes control plane API server. Typically, you deploy 3 of those for HA, but one is the lead controller. And this is where the rules will get set. You can REST API to control NeuVector into there. This is where events will be collected and then sent out to your SIM system. And new rules will be pushed down to each of the nodes. The next component are what's called scanners. And these typically, the default is 2 scanner pods running, but you can scale this up as a replica set, just like you can any Kubernetes deployment. So if you have a large registry, you can have 10 scanner pods running, and Kubernetes can make sure it's distributed onto available servers. So it scales very quickly as you need that type of scanning performance. There's a web console, which actually uses the REST API to get its information from the controller. And then the real workhorse of NeuVector is a container called the enforcer. And that's going to provide the heavy lifting, the packet filtering on every host for every pod connection, the monitoring every process and file activity in every container, as well as on the host itself. So the enforcer is your runtime security monitoring agent, as well as the enforcer to prevent or block network connections or processes. I hesitated there because I said a bad word, agent. We like to say we're not an agent because agents really are software and OS dependent, and we're just a container. So sorry if I said a bad word there. All right, so we have a question. NeuVector can expect network traffic, but isn't using a sidecar or like a service mesh. Will this still work if we are using Istio? Great question. So the enforcer is deployed as a daemon set, and so that's 1 on every host. This is not a sidecar. Sidecars are too heavyweight. If you have 1,000 containers, you're going to require 1,000 sidecars. That's very heavyweight. Now, you may be aware, like Istio, which is a service mesh on top of this, requires a sidecar. And that sidecar is going to run in every pod. And it can, for example, encrypt the traffic going out of that pod. Now, NeuVector integrates with Istio and can even protect the Istio control plane. So we are able to inspect the network traffic within the pod. So when your application workload makes its connection, it's going to go within the pod to your Istio sidecar proxy, and then it's going to get decrypted and sent out. We can inspect it before that encryption happens, so we can still apply all of the network protections and inspections that you get in a non-service mesh environment. And then in addition to that, we are monitoring all of the Istio control plane, proxy, sidecar containers, as well as the kube system containers, kube API server, kubelet, and all of those as well. So I mentioned, that NeuVector can learn using behavioral learning. This is the discover mode of NeuVector. Once you're comfortable with the discover mode and all the rules are in place, you can switch to a monitor mode. And then NeuVector will allow any of that unauthorized behavior, but it will just alert you through a webhook or a SIM system. And then protect mode, you can choose for certain applications to put them in protect mode. And that's where we're actually going to block unauthorized network connections, network attacks, or unauthorized processes or file activity. I talked about the service meshes. That was the question about inspecting network traffic, even in a Istio environment. So Yes, we have great support for all service meshes, inspecting the traffic on the loopback, monitoring systems, doing packet captures. All of those capabilities are able to do even when you've turned on encryption. We are certified in the DOD Iron Bank. So if there's any military customers out there, that's something we can provide. And I mentioned security as code. That I won't spend too much time on this, but I'll just give you a peek at what the YAML file for our CRD looks like. The CRD is defined as an NV security rule. We can create all of this for you by learning the behavior. So egress policies on what's allowed to egress the cluster, what's allowed to come into this, this application here. You can see protocols, HTTP and WordPress is allowed into this pod. Here's the processes that are allowed in the container, Nginx processes, it looks like. File activity, so what type of file activity is allowed in the container. All of those are expressed in a very human readable, typical Kubernetes YAML file. And what mode should this be in: monitor, protect, or discover when we run it? So as I mentioned, this is really a powerful tool. It enables you to version control your security policies. You can create this on an application basis or on global security rule basis. You can have your your security team have global rules like don't allow SSH or SCP into containers and push that out to all containers. So a very powerful tool. Now, if you're going to try NeuVector, the deployment is, because we're just a container, we have sample YAML files, Helm charts, operators. We even recently did a Terraform webinar on how to automatically deploy NeuVector. So it can take 5 minutes, 20 minutes. It really just depends on if you've had all your integration set up prior. The actual deployment and logging into the console can be as quick as a few minutes. But because even though it's that easy, we do have solution architects who are standing by and would love to help you plan out your tests and your deployment and really help you understand how and when to move your deployments from the discover mode to the monitor to the protect mode. Can look at show you a brief look at our console. Another question, how long does the discover mode take? Oh, well, that can be as quick as fast as you run your test scripts to exercise your applications in your infrastructure. So let's say you have NeuVector deployed in your staging environment or test environment. You deploy your applications, you run all your tests on your applications. Those applications are going to make connections. They're going to have processes and file activity. We're going to learn all that. Now, if it takes you 10 minutes to run through that, then you're ready to review that, export it, make security as code from it. A lot of customers of ours say, well, just to be safe, maybe I'll run it for a few days in discover mode or a week. There are some open source, if you're using open source components, there are some open source components that try to make an external connections to check for new versions or something like that. And they may do that once a day or once a week. And you may or may not want to allow that. So sometimes these connections don't always happen immediately when the application runs. So if you want to make sure you capture everything, you can run it for a few days. And then you're ready to review it and run, and then switch to the monitor mode. So NeuVector, this is the console. You can manage multiple NeuVector deployments from a single console. So these are multiple clusters running on different public clouds that I can switch to. I can also propagate global security rules to all my clusters if I want to. I can see here in the network activity view all of the network connections that are going on in my cluster. And you can imagine that this can get pretty complicated if you've got thousands of containers running. So we enable you to filter it very easily by namespace or group, or will automatically collapse groups when there's a certain number of containers. All of the blue lines are connections that were discovered during that discovery mode, and rules were created to allow HTTP between these pods, or Redis between this and our Redis pod. Once you've locked down into monitor or protect mode, then you any violation of that, like here's Nginx trying to go external, will exit the cluster. Any type of network segmentation violation will be shown in red and either be alerted or blocked depending on the mode you've set in. So here I'm in the monitor mode. I can switch to protect mode. I can also do things like see all my live network sessions, do a packet capture or quarantine. Any of these things can be done by rules or through the REST API as well. So that's a quick view of the network capabilities. We're also showing you the Kubernetes version, the vulnerabilities there, all of the hosts that you're running on and vulnerabilities on the host, as well as in containers, vulnerabilities in CIS benchmarks in actual containers as well. Here is where you'll create the registry scanning. So this is where you'll scan certain registries and be able to see the results. And if you click on that, we'll show you what's called a layered scan result, which is where are these 4 vulnerabilities, in which layer, they're in this layer. So it makes it easier to remediate these vulnerabilities. We'll also show you compliance violations on images, as well as a list of the packages and modules in your image and vulnerabilities listed by package and module. And then the real runtime security happens here in the policy, admission control rules, groups, network rules, response rules, and DLP sensors. So I'll just highlight real quickly how I can go to one of my applications, my Node.js pod application. I can see my file rules, my network rules, my process rules, and at any point in time, if I was in a staging or test environment, I can export that, and I will export that as security as code. And this is where I'm able to look at all the rules that are expressed here in this console. I'm able to open that up in a Kubernetes-friendly YAML file, review that, check this in as code, and then do a kube control apply of this file into my production environment. And all of these rules that you see here will show up in my production environment. And then I can deploy my application because it's going to be protected when it's deployed. The vulnerability explorer that I talked about to make it easy to remediate vulnerabilities is here in this vulnerabilities and compliance tab. And we'll actually show you, are there any running containers that are running, any image which has any vulnerabilities, and are they protected or not protected by NeuVector? And then finally, all of the violations and suspicious activity are going to be reported here in the notification screen. And these are what can also be sent to your SIM system by syslog, or you can set up webhook alerts to be able to send these out through a webhook alert. Or you can have other, like a Prometheus Grafana dashboard to export all of this. So it's very flexible in terms of reporting. And last question before we run out of time, isn't NeuVector just using EBP or BPF? You can do packet capture. How is it possible to do packet capture with BPF? So NeuVector's core technology is this packet filtering technology. So we've written our own packet filtering. We do not use BPF or eBPF for that. one of our co-founders comes from Fortinet, where he wrote all the deep packet inspection engines there. So we have really deep expertise on packet filtering for layer 7 firewalls. And when we looked at eBPF, we found that it wasn't flexible enough. It wasn't multi-protocol. It wasn't looking at a bunch of threats, network threats built in that we needed to add to it. And performance-wise, we were concerned that in thousands of transactions going through our packet filter, it had to be really fast. We also had to be able to block on a connection-by-connection basis and do things like packet capture. So that's all our core technology. We're not using BPF for that. We are using eBPF for certain other functions. They're kind of optional functions, like when we monitor processes. If that driver for BPF is in the kernel, we will use it to help filter what are the relevant processes that we should be inspecting. Otherwise, if it's not there, we just work fine as well. So that's all technology that we built from scratch. All right, we're past the time for today. I hope that you enjoyed this very quick overview of NeuVector. If anyone else has any questions, I can certainly try to answer those. I can stay a minute or two longer if anyone else has any additional questions. Otherwise, everyone have a good day. So thank you and enjoy your day. Oh, and if you do want to contact NeuVector, go to our website at NeuVector.com. There's a number of ways to contact us, either through the website, contact@NeuVector.com, info@NeuVector.com. So many ways to reach out to us, ask more questions, schedule a more detailed demo, or even start trying NeuVector on your own. All right. Have a good day, everyone.